before we begin this incredible story. Now, let's dive in. The coffee in the Pentagon cafeteria tasted like burnt rubber. She sat alone at a corner table, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed training reports. At 52 years old, she had spent the last 15 years behind a desk, managing pilot programs and signing paperwork. Her uniform was crisp, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. And to anyone passing by, she looked like just another officer, counting down the days to retirement. Nobody in that cafeteria knew that 30 years ago. Sarah Mitchell had been Captain Sarah Chen, one of the most skilled fighter pilots the Air Force had ever seen. She had flown missions that were still classified, pulled off maneuvers that became legend among those who knew, and earned the call sign Phoenix for her ability to bring damaged aircraft home against impossible odds. But all of that felt like another lifetime. After a near-fatal crash during a classified operation, she had quietly accepted a desk job, letting her legend fade into whispers and old files that few people ever accessed. Her phone buzzed. It was General Marcus Webb, her old squadron commander. The message was brief, but urgent. "Need you at Hangar 7 now? This is not a request." Sarah felt something stir in her chest, something she had not felt in years. She grabbed her cap and headed for the door. Weaving through the morning rush of junior officers and clerks who barely glanced her way, Hangar 7 was on the far side of the base, a restricted area where experimental aircraft and emergency operations were housed. When Sarah arrived, 2 armed guards checked her identification 3 times before letting her through. Inside, the massive space was buzzing with activity. Technicians ran between computer stations. And in the center of it all sat an F-22 Raptor, one of the most advanced fighter jets in the world. Its sleek body gleamed under the harsh lights. Just looking at it made Sarah's hands tremble slightly. General Webb strode toward her, his face grave. He was older now, his hair completely gray, but his eyes still held that sharp intelligence she remembered. "Sarah, we have a situation," he said without preamble. "One of our pilots is down with acute appendicitis. We have a critical intercept mission launching in 40 minutes. The threat is real and immediate. We need someone who can fly that bird." He paused, watching her reaction. "I need Phoenix." Sarah stared at him. "Marcus, I have not touched a stick in 15 years. I do training evaluations. I push papers. You need an active pilot, not a desk jockey." But even as she said the words, her eyes kept drifting back to the F-22. Her fingers flexed unconsciously, remembering the feel of a throttle, the slight vibration of a fighter coming to life beneath her. Webb stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The mission profile requires split-second timing and instincts that cannot be taught in a simulator. Our other qualified pilots are scattered across 3 different bases. You are here, you have the clearance, and despite what you think, I know you still have what it takes. I would not ask if there was any other option." He held out a flight suit. "The question is, do you?" Sarah took the flight suit, the material rough and familiar in her hands. Around them, the hangar seemed to hold its breath. A young lieutenant approached nervously, holding a tablet with mission parameters. He looked at Sarah with barely concealed skepticism. Sarah met his eyes and saw herself reflected there, young and doubtful. She turned back to Webb and nodded once. "Brief me on the way, and somebody find me a helmet that fits." The locker room smelled of jet fuel and industrial cleaner, scents that transported Sarah back 3 decades in an instant. Her hands moved on autopilot as she suited up, pulling on the layers of gear that had once been like a second skin. The flight suit fit differently than she remembered, tighter in some places, looser in others. But as she zipped it up, something inside her began to wake up. She caught her reflection in a mirror and barely recognized herself. Gone was the tired desk officer, replaced by something harder, more focused. Webb briefed her as she walked toward the aircraft. "We have an unidentified aircraft approaching restricted airspace at high speed. It is not responding to any communications and has made evasive maneuvers suggesting hostile intent. Your mission is to intercept, identify, and if necessary, engage. Rules of engagement are in your packet, but Sarah, trust your gut out there like you always did."
Ow.
The crew chief, a weathered master sergeant named Rodriguez, met her at the ladder. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her rank and age, but he was professional enough to keep his mouth shut. "Colonel, the bird is fueled and armed. All systems are green. She is ready to fly if you are ready to take her up." Sarah nodded and began climbing the ladder. Each step felt like climbing back into her own past. Settling into the cockpit was like greeting an old friend who had aged while you were away. The layout was different from the F-16S she had flown. More advanced, with touchscreens and systems she had only read about in reports. But the fundamentals were the same. Stick, throttle, rudder pedals, the familiar embrace of the ejection seat. Her hands found their places without conscious thought, and she began running through the startup sequence. The young lieutenant from earlier appeared on a headset, his voice tinny and uncertain. "Colonel Mitchell, Tower here. Are you sure about this? No disrespect intended, but this aircraft requires current certification and recent flight hours." Sarah smiled inside her helmet. "Tower, Phoenix is back in the saddle. Let's light this candle." She fired up the engines, and the Raptor roared to life beneath her. The vibration traveled through her body, waking up muscles and instincts that had been dormant for years. The runway stretched out before her like a promise. Ground control cleared her for immediate takeoff, and Sarah pushed the throttle forward. The acceleration pressed her back into the seat, gravity trying to hold her down as the fighter jet screamed down the runway. At rotation speed, she pulled back on the stick, and the earth fell away. The F-22 climbed like a rocket, punching through thin clouds into brilliant sunshine. Sarah's breath came faster, her heart pounding not from fear, but from pure exhilaration. This was where she belonged. This was who she really was. The ground fell away to a patchwork of fields and roads, then to abstract patterns of geography. She banked the aircraft smoothly, feeling its responses, learning its personality. Command came through her headset. "Phoenix, we have your target bearing 270, altitude 40,000 feet, speed Mach 1.5. Intercept and identify." Sarah acknowledged and pushed the Raptor into a climb, engaging the afterburners. The jet leaped forward, and she felt the old rush of speed and danger mixing in her blood. Within minutes, her radar picked up the contact. It was moving fast and erratically, clearly trying to avoid detection, as she closed the distance. Sarah ran through her training, her mind sharp and clear in a way it had not been in years. Every instrument reading, every radar blip, every radio call was processed and acted upon with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The target was now visible on her targeting display. She armed her systems and opened a channel. "Unidentified aircraft. This is United States Air Force. You have entered restricted airspace. Identify yourself immediately and change your heading to 180, or you will be engaged." There was no response. The aircraft continued its approach, now clearly on a course toward a major population center. Sarah's jaw tightened. She maneuvered into position, every movement precise and calculated. In the back of her mind, she heard the voices of all the young pilots she had trained over the years. All the rules she had drilled into them. But she also heard her own voice from 30 years ago. It's the one that had trusted instinct over protocol when lives were on the line. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether she was still the pilot they called Phoenix, or just an old officer who should have stayed behind her desk. Sarah brought the F-22 around in a sweeping arc, positioning herself behind and slightly above the target aircraft. Her radar showed it clearly now, a modified civilian jet that had been stripped down and souped up for speed. This was no lost tourist plane. Someone had put serious money and skill into making this aircraft fast and maneuverable. She tried the radio again, cycling through all emergency frequencies. "Unidentified aircraft, this is your final warning. You are in violation of restricted airspace. Respond immediately or I will be forced to take action." Static crackled in her ears, and then a voice came through, rough and accented. "American pilot, you are wasting your time. Turn away now while you still can." The channel went dead. Sarah felt ice water trickle down her spine. This was not confusion or a navigation error. This was deliberate. She reported back to command, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Command, Phoenix. Target is confirmed hostile. Requesting authorization to engage. There was a pause that felt like an eternity. She knew what was happening back at the base. Generals and colonels were scrambling, making calls, checking protocols, covering themselves legally and politically. Meanwhile, the hostile aircraft was getting closer to populated areas with every second that ticked by. Sarah watched her instruments, calculating intercept angles and firing solutions automatically, her hands ready on the controls. Finally, command came back. Phoenix, you are authorized to engage if the target does not comply. Use minimum necessary force. Repeat, minimum necessary force. Sarah acknowledged and pushed her throttle forward, closing the gap. She could see the other aircraft now with her own eyes, a sleek shape cutting through the sky. She fired a warning burst with her cannon, tracers streaking past the target's wing. The other pilot should have gotten the message loud and clear. Instead, the hostile aircraft suddenly broke hard left and dove, a maneuver so aggressive it should have torn the wings off a civilian jet. Sarah's eyebrows rose. Whoever was flying that thing knew what they were doing. She rolled inverted and pulled through, following the dive, her training coming back as if she had never left the cockpit. The two aircraft spiraled downward in a deadly dance, losing altitude fast. The ground rushed up to meet them, mountains and valleys taking shape below. The hostile pilot was good, Sarah had to admit. He used terrain for cover, skimming through valleys and pulling tight turns around ridgelines. But Sarah was better. She had flown through mountains in Kosovo, had threaded canyons in Afghanistan, had brought damaged aircraft home through weather that grounded every other pilot. Her call sign had not been earned by luck. She anticipated his moves before he made them, cutting angles and closing distance with the patience of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. They blasted over a small town, low enough that people on the ground would hear the sonic booms and run outside to look up. Sarah grimaced. This was getting too dangerous. She needed to end it now before civilians got hurt. She keyed her radio one more time. Last chance. You cannot outrun me, and you cannot outmaneuver me. Land the aircraft now, or I will shoot you down. The response was a burst of profanity in 3 different languages. Sarah sighed and flipped the master arm switch. Her targeting computer locked onto the hostile aircraft, the tone steady and clear in her helmet. She had fired weapons in anger before, had made the hard decisions that came with combat. But it never got easier. Her finger rested on the trigger as she gave the other pilot 5 more seconds to make the right choice. The seconds ticked away like hammer blows. 3, 2, 1. The hostile aircraft suddenly pulled up hard, climbing almost vertically. Sarah followed without hesitation, afterburners screaming. They climbed through 10,000 feet, 15,000, 20,000, the sky darkening to deep blue above them. The other pilot was trying to gain an energy advantage to get above her and reverse the situation. It was a classic maneuver, one that might have worked against a younger, less experienced pilot. But Sarah had invented half the tactics they taught at Top Gun. She knew exactly what was coming next and exactly how to counter it. At 30,000 feet, the hostile aircraft ran out of energy and stalled, exactly as Sarah knew it would. The pilot tried to recover, to convert altitude back into speed, but Sarah was already there waiting. She had positioned herself perfectly, and now the other aircraft hung in her crosshairs like a target on a range. Her finger tightened on the trigger, but something made her pause. Call it instinct. Call it experience. But something felt wrong about the whole situation. She zoomed in with her targeting camera, trying to get a visual on the cockpit. What she saw made her blood run cold. The pilot was slumped forward, unconscious or dead. The aircraft was flying on some kind of autopilot, executing pre-programmed maneuvers. This was not a suicide mission. This was something else entirely. Sarah immediately radioed command. Command. Phoenix. Target pilot appears incapacitated. Aircraft may be remotely controlled or on autopilot. Advise. The response was swift and urgent. Phoenix Intelligence confirms your assessment. We believe this is a test of our response systems. Do not destroy the aircraft. Repeat, do not destroy. We need it intact for analysis. Can you force it down? Sarah looked at the crippled aircraft wallowing in the thin air ahead of her. Force it down? With what? Harsh language? But orders were orders, and if this was some kind of drone technology test by a foreign power, they needed that aircraft in one piece. An idea formed in her mind, crazy and dangerous, but it might just work. She had done it once before, 28 years ago over the Pacific, when a trainee had panicked and frozen at the controls. She brought the F-22 in close, closer than any sane pilot would dare, until her wingtip was just feet from the other aircraft's tail. Then she tapped her rudder, using her jet wash to buffet the other aircraft. To push it off course, the hostile aircraft yawed left, its control surfaces responding to the turbulence. Sarah stayed with it, herding it like a sheepdog with a stubborn sheep, using her superior position and power to guide it away from populated areas. Sweat ran down her face inside her helmet. One wrong move, one moment of inattention, and both aircraft would collide in a fireball that would rain debris over square miles. Her hands were steady on the controls, making tiny adjustments every second. Reading the air and the aircraft with senses that went beyond instruments, they descended together in a slow spiral. Sarah constantly adjusting her position to guide the hostile aircraft toward a dry lake bed she remembered from the mission briefing. It was federal land, far from any towns or roads, a perfect emergency landing site. Command was talking in her ear, relaying information and updates, but she tuned most of it out. Right now, it was just her, 2 aircraft, and the laws of physics. Everything else was noise. At 5,000 feet, she could see the lake bed clearly, a white expanse of cracked earth stretching for miles. She nudged the hostile aircraft toward it, using her jet wash and careful positioning to alter its course degree by degree. The other pilot, if he was still alive in there, would be feeling the roughest ride of his life. Sarah brought the F-22 around in front of the other aircraft, risking everything on one final maneuver. She dropped her landing gear and deployed her speed brakes, slowing dramatically and forcing the hostile aircraft to overshoot as it passed her. She swung back into position behind and above, now herding it downward toward the lake bed. The hostile aircraft's autopilot seemed to recognize the flat surface below and began a landing sequence. Sarah held her breath as it descended, wobbling slightly but holding together. At 50 feet, at 30, at 10, and then its wheels touched down on the hardpan. Dust exploded in massive plumes as the aircraft bounced once, twice, then settled and rolled. Slower and slower until it finally stopped in a cloud of white dust. Sarah circled overhead, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Command was shouting in her ear, people were cheering, but all she could do was stare at the aircraft sitting alone on the lake bed. She had done it. Against all odds, with skills she thought she had lost forever, she had done it. She reported the successful forced landing and requested recovery teams for the site and medical support for the pilot as she turned the F-22 back toward base. The adrenaline began to drain away, leaving her shaky and exhausted. The sun was lower in the sky now, painting the clouds in shades of orange and gold. She climbed to cruising altitude and engaged the autopilot for the flight home, allowing herself a moment to close her eyes and just breathe. When she opened them again, she saw her reflection in the cockpit canopy. She looked different somehow. Alive. Real. Like she had finally found something she had lost long ago. The landing back at base was smooth, almost anticlimactic after everything that had happened. As Sarah taxied the FTSTD back to its hangar, she could see a crowd gathered on the tarmac. News traveled fast on a military base, and apparently everyone wanted to see the desk officer who had just pulled off an impossible mission. She shut down the engines, the sudden silence almost deafening after hours of jet noise, and popped the canopy. The crew chief Rodriguez was at the ladder again, but this time his face wore a huge grin. "Colonel, that was one hell of a show. I have been working on fighters for 23 years, and I have never seen flying like that." Sarah climbed down carefully, her legs stiff and her back aching. The flight suit was soaked with sweat, and she probably smelled like a gym locker, but she had never felt more satisfied. General Webb pushed through the crowd, followed by a pack of officers and intelligence. Personnel all talking at once. Webb raised his hand for silence and simply pulled Sarah into a bear hug. "Phoenix rides again," he said quietly in her ear. "I knew you still had it in you." He stepped back and addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you just witnessed was a masterclass in fighter pilot skill and judgment. Colonel Mitchell not only intercepted a hostile aircraft, but brought it down intact, using tactics I have never seen before. The intelligence value alone is going to keep our analysts busy for months." Sarah shook her head. "Sir, with respect, I just did what needed to be done." Any qualified pilot would have Webb cut her off with a look. "No, Sarah. Any qualified pilot would have shot that aircraft down, which would have been correct by the book, but would have left us with nothing but wreckage and questions. You made a decision in the moment based on years of experience and instinct. That is not something you can teach in a classroom." Intelligence officer, a nervous captain with thick glasses, stepped forward with a tablet. "Colonel Mitchell, the pilot of the hostile aircraft, is alive and in custody. He is a mercenary hired to test our response systems by parties unknown. The aircraft was equipped with experimental remote control systems that we need to analyze. Your decision to force it down rather than destroy it has given us a significant intelligence advantage." Sarah nodded. Filing that information away for later consideration, a young reporter from the base newspaper pushed forward with a camera. "Colonel Mitchell, how does it feel to be back in the cockpit after so many years? And is it true you were one of the original Top Gun instructors?" Sarah groaned internally. There it was. The questions she had avoided for 15 years were now unavoidable. She looked around at the sea of young faces, pilots and crew members who had probably never heard of Captain Sarah Chen or her call sign Phoenix. She took a breath and decided that maybe it was time to stop hiding. "Yes, I was a Top Gun instructor 30 years ago. I flew combat missions in multiple theaters and trained some of the finest pilots in the Air Force. Then I had a bad crash. I thought my flying days were over. I accepted a desk job and convinced myself that was enough. But today showed me something important. It showed me that some skills never really leave you, and some parts of yourself you should never bury, no matter how much time passes." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Sarah continued, "I am not special. I am just someone who got a second chance to do what I was meant to do. Every one of you has that same potential inside you. The question is whether you will recognize it when your moment comes." She looked at Webb. "Sir, permission to debrief so I can get out of this sweat-soaked flight suit?" The crowd laughed, and the tension broke. Over the next few hours, Sarah gave multiple debriefings to different groups. Intelligence wanted every detail about the hostile aircraft's behavior. Training Command wanted to analyze her tactics. Medical wanted to make sure she had not suffered any ill effects from the high-G maneuvers. Through it all, she remained professional and thorough, but inside, her mind was elsewhere. She kept replaying the flight, remembering the feel of the stick in her hand. The infinite blue sky above her, the pure concentration of life or death decisions made in split seconds. Finally, near midnight, she was allowed to return to her quarters. She showered, washing away the sweat and jet fuel smell, and collapsed onto her bed in a clean uniform. Her body ached in ways she had forgotten were possible, but it was a good ache. The ache of muscles used properly for the first time in too long. Her phone buzzed with messages of congratulation from old friends and colleagues. People she had not heard from in years. All emerging from the woodwork now that her story was out. One message made her pause. It was from her daughter, Emily, a graduate student studying aerospace engineering. "Mom, I just saw the news. I always knew you were a badass, but wow. Can we talk? I want to hear the whole story." Sarah smiled and typed back a response. "Tomorrow, I promise. Love you." She set the phone aside and stared at the ceiling, thinking about choices and consequences, about the person she had been and the person she had become. The morning sun streamed through the blinds when Sarah woke, later than she had in years. Her body protested as she sat up, muscles screaming from yesterday's exertions, but along with the pain came something else, a sense of purpose she had not felt since. She was a young pilot proving herself in a male-dominated field. She dressed carefully in her uniform, taking extra time to get everything perfect. Today was going to be different from every other day of the past 15 years. At breakfast in the officers' mess, something strange happened. People who normally would not have given her a second glance now nodded respectfully as she passed. Young pilots and crew members approached her table, asking questions about tactics and flying, treating her not like a desk officer, but like the combat veteran she was. Sarah found herself enjoying it, sharing stories and lessons learned, seeing the hunger for knowledge in their eyes. General Webb found her there and pulled up a chair. "We need to talk about your future," he said without preamble. He slid a folder across the table. "The Chief of Staff called me personally this morning. Your little stunt yesterday got some very high-level attention. They want to offer you command of the Advanced Tactical Training Program at Nellis. You would be training the next generation of Top Gun pilots, sharing everything you know before you retire." Sarah opened the folder, scanning the orders. It was a prestigious position, the kind of assignment that would cap off any career with honors and recognition. But it was still a training position, still working with simulators and classrooms rather than actual aircraft. She looked up at Webb. "What if I do not want a training position? What if I want to fly?" Webb leaned back, a knowing smile on his face. "I was hoping you would say that. There is another option, one that is highly irregular and will require some strings to be pulled. We have a new program testing integration between experienced pilots and AI co-pilot systems in advanced fighters. They need someone with your skills and judgment to help develop the protocols. It would mean going back through flight certification, passing all the physical and mental tests, and probably dealing with some resentment from younger pilots who think you are too old." Sarah thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. "Where do I sign?" Webb laughed and pulled out another set of papers. "I already had them prepared. Report to flight medicine tomorrow morning at O600. They're going to test every system in your body to make sure yesterday was not a fluke. Then you have 2 weeks of recertification training. After that, you are officially back in the cockpit." The next 2 weeks were the hardest of Sarah's life. The physical training alone nearly broke her. Running 5 miles in full gear at 52 was nothing like running at 22. The younger pilots in her recertification class treated her with a mixture of awe and skepticism, wondering if the old lady could really keep up. Sarah answered them by outscoring them on every written test and matching them maneuver for maneuver in the simulator. The day of her final check ride, Sarah stood in front of the mirror in the locker room, looking at herself in a flight suit that now bore the patches of an active pilot rather than a desk officer. Her hands were calloused again from working the controls. Her eyes had regained the sharp focus of someone who lived and breathed aviation. She was Phoenix again, risen from the ashes of her old desk job, ready to fly. Her instructor for the check ride was a hotshot young captain named Torres, who had made it clear he thought this whole thing was a waste of time. He ran her through every possible scenario, trying to find the limits of her skill and age. Sarah met every challenge with the calm competence of someone who had done all this before when Torres was still in diapers. By the end of the flight, his attitude had shifted from skepticism to respect. "Colonel," he said, as they climbed out of the aircraft, "I owe you an apology. You fly better than half the instructors I know." Sarah received her flight certification that afternoon in a small ceremony attended by General Webb and a handful of other officers who knew the full story. As she accepted the papers that officially made her an active pilot again, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From hotshot young fighter pilot to broken crash victim to desk officer to legend reborn, she had come full circle. But this time, she would not let fear or doubt push her into hiding. That evening, she video-called her daughter Emily. When her daughter's face appeared on the screen, Sarah could see pride and curiosity there. "So, Mom, tell me everything, and do not leave anything out." Sarah smiled and began the story, not just of the emergency mission, but of her whole career, the parts she had never talked about before. She told Emily about the crashes and the close calls, about the missions that saved lives and the ones that still haunted her dreams. "Why did you stop flying in the first place?" Emily asked at one point. Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking about the crash that had nearly killed her. The months of recovery, the fear that had convinced her she was done. "I stopped because I was afraid," she finally said. Afraid that I had lost my edge. Afraid that I would let people down. Afraid that the best part of my life was over. But I learned something important these past few weeks. Fear is not the enemy. Letting fear make your decisions for you is the enemy. Melly nodded slowly. I am proud of you, Mom. Not because you are some Top Gun legend, or because you pulled off an impossible mission. I am proud because you found your way back to who you really are. That takes more courage than any combat mission. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Thanks, sweetheart. That means more than you know. Now how about you tell me about your thesis project? I heard something about revolutionary engine designs. As they talked late into the night, Sarah felt the last pieces of her old life fall away. She was no longer hiding from her past or pretending to be something she was not. She was Colonel Sarah Mitchell, call sign Phoenix, fighter pilot and instructor, mentor and friend. And tomorrow, she would wake up and do what she was meant to do, fly. The sky was waiting, infinite and blue, and she had a lot of lost time to make up for. For the first time in 15 years, Sarah went to sleep with a smile on her face. Already dreaming of clouds and speed and the perfect freedom of flight,